Most people are not destroyed by poverty. They are destroyed by abundance. They were never trained to contain. That is the first truth I would force into your head if you woke up tomorrow and discovered that a bank account, a lawyer, a lottery ticket, a relative estate, or a lucky break had just dropped a flood of money into your life. Sudden wealth is not a reward. It is a pressure test. If you have spent your whole life carrying cups, and one morning somebody hands you a reservoir, the reservoir does not make you wise. It makes you dangerous to yourself. The water is not the problem. Your unprepared hands are the problem. Your old impulses are the problem. Your old social circle is the problem. Your old fantasies are the problem. Your old wounds are the problem. Your old appetite. Now, given real purchasing power is the problem. That is why so many people who get rich fast end up broke again. The source material says this plainly with lottery winners. Most do not keep the money because they do not know how to hold it. They have never built wealth, never defended capital, never learned the difference between a fortune and a spending spree, and the money leaves as quickly as it arrived. Fe Philosite Fe Turn 83, File 0 Fe. That does not surprise me at all. A flood does not ask whether you're ready. It reveals whether you built walls. So if sudden money ever enters your life, the first thing I want you to understand is this. Your job is not to celebrate. Your job is to contain. I call this the reservoir principle. The reservoir principle says that every large sudden sum of money must first be held, cooled, protected, and given structure before it is allowed to touch your lifestyle. If you violate that order, the money does not become freedom, it becomes velocity. And velocity in the hands of an untrained mind is just a more expensive way to crash. That is why the source begins with privacy. It says the first rule is to tell nobody to shut your mouth. To resist the broke impulse to announce the good news to everyone around you. Fe Philosite Fe Turn 83, File 0 Fe. That is not paranoia. That is perimeter control. The moment other people know you have sudden money, the reservoir is no longer yours alone. It becomes a public well in their imagination. They will arrive with stories, needs, business ideas, emotional leverage, and old debts written in invisible ink. People who never cared much about your future will suddenly care deeply about your generosity. Relatives will remember a warmth they never showed. Friends will discover ventures. Old classmates will discover emergencies. Ex-partners will discover sentiment. Strangers will discover trust in your judgment that did not exist when your checking account was thin. This is why silence is not rude. It is structural. I call it the secrecy perimeter. The secrecy perimeter is the wall you throw up around new money before other people can start mentally dividing it into shares that belong to them. If you violate this, you do not merely create awkwardness. You create a social siege before you even understand the map of your own life. The second move, and the source is right here too, is debt removal. It says the first and only immediate expense worth making is paying off your existing debt. Fe Felicite Fe Turn 83 File 0 Fe. That is because debt is not just a bill. Debt is a leak in the dam. A reservoir with holes is not a reservoir. It is an expensive illusion. Interest eats first. It eats quietly. It eats while you are sleeping. It eats while you are emotionally distracted by your new status. It eats while you are pretending that because you now have money, debt no longer matters. That is exactly how stupid people become newly broke. So the old debt has to go: credit cards, personal loans, any toxic carry that is bleeding your future. I call this patching the spillway. If water is rushing in and leaks are still open, you are not rich. You are briefly wet. But after that, and this is where most people fail, you must stop. Do not confuse paying off old debt with earning the right to create new debt. The source warns about exactly this. It says many people think the money means debt no longer matters because they can always repay it now. And that is how the trap resets. Fe Philosite Fe Turn 83 File 0 Fe. You have to understand the psychology here. Sudden money creates a false feeling of invincibility. It tells you that because your account changed, your instincts matured. That is a lie. Your account can jump in a week. Your character does not. If you were impulsive before, now you are impulsive with capital. If you were insecure before, now you are insecure with purchasing power. If you were sloppy before, now you are sloppy at a higher price. That is why the third move matters so much. Do not quit your job yet. The source says this very directly, warning that quitting immediately is one of the first dominoes in a sequence that ends in personal bankruptcy. A few years later, Fe Felicite Fe Turn 83 File 0 Fe. That is one of the smartest lines in the document. Because work is not just income, work is structure, routine, camouflage. It preserves your normal rhythm while the reservoir settles. The newly rich person who storms into the office to tell the boss to go to hell usually thinks he is proving power. Often, he is simply tearing down the last piece of stable architecture in his old life before he has built any new one. I call this false liberation. False liberation is when money removes one pressure, and your ego responds by deleting discipline instead of buying time. You think the reservoir means you no longer need banks, budgets, schedules, or restraint. In reality, what you needed was a cooler mind, not a more dramatic gesture. Keep the job, keep the rhythm, let the internal weather settle. That brings me to the fourth move, and it may be the most emotionally difficult of all. Let the money sit. The source recommends letting the funds remain largely untouched for 6 months after debt is cleared, precisely because your mind needs time to process the shock. Fe Falicite Fe Turn 83 File 0 Fe, that is exactly right. You do not need movement, you need sediment to fall. I call this the settling window. The settling window is the period where you are not deciding what the money can buy. You are discovering what parts of you become irrational in its presence. The dream house that felt obvious in week 1 may look absurd by month 4. The business idea that felt brilliant in week 2 may reveal itself as wounded vanity by month 5. The revenge purchase loses heat, the status purchase loses glow. The I deserve this voice gets quieter. That is good. Let it get quieter. A reservoir filled with muddy water is not ready for drinking. It needs stillness. Your judgment works the same way. Now, most people hate stillness because stillness gives old fantasies nowhere to hide. They want to act because action feels like proof they are now important. They want the new car, the rich zip code, the wardrobe correction, the public signal, the soft leather, the new social posture. But if you let the money touch identity before it touches structure, you will destroy the very thing that could have changed your whole bloodline. That is why the fifth move the source suggests is so important. Learn before you spend. The document tells you to invest in yourself first, to build financial literacy, to understand money before moving it around recklessly. Fe File Site Fe Turn 83 File 0 Fe, that is not optional. Sudden wealth does not make you a steward. It makes stewardship urgent. I call this reservoir literacy. Reservoir literacy means understanding what capital actually is. Not what your old friends think it is, not what advertising taught you it is, not what movies dressed it up as. Capital is not a giant permission slip. Capital is a machine if you let it remain intact. It is an engine if you do not cut it apart for temporary heat. The source itself later uses a tree metaphor and the 5% rule, saying you should live off the fruit rather than chop down the tree for firewood. Fe File Site Fe Turn 83 File 0 Fe. That is a very good metaphor. I will phrase it more bluntly. Your principle is not spending money. It is the thing that can generate spending money for the rest of your life if you stop treating it like a shopping event. That is why education comes before expansion. Now, the source includes a point that I want to refine carefully because it depends on context. Do not immediately switch financial advisors, especially if the money came through a wealthy relative who had established professional relationships. The document argues that if the fortune survives under a certain advisor, there may be good reason not to rip the money away in a burst of ego before you understand how the system was being managed. Fe File Site Fe Turn 83 File 0 Fe. That is often correct, though not automatically. The deeper principle is this: do not fire the engineer before you have read the dam. If the money came from someone disciplined, someone who kept it and grew it, there is a decent chance that the invisible structure around that capital contains more intelligence than your first week of excitement. That does not mean blind trust. It means Don T. confused novelty with improvement. A new rich person is extremely vulnerable to smooth talkers, new managers, new friends, new deal makers, and new parasites who smell confusion better than dogs smell meat. So if you inherited the reservoir, spend time understanding the existing channels before you redraw them. Then comes one of the hardest lessons of all: get comfortable, not rich comfortable. The source says, pay off the house if that truly simplifies life, but do not move to a rich person neighborhood. Do not buy every family member a car, and do not rebuild your whole life according to what you imagine rich life is supposed to look like. Fe File Site Fe Turn 83 File 0 Fe. That is one of the wisest warnings in the entire piece. I call this the comfort ceiling. The comfort ceiling is where you fix your life without turning your costs into a monster. You improve the plumbing, you remove needless pressure, you create breathing room, but you stop before comfort becomes status theater. That is the line where a blessing becomes maintenance burden. Most people think wealth means upgrading the visible world first. That is backwards. The first job of wealth is to lower coercion, not raise optics. A nicer house in a richer neighborhood often arrives with property taxes, maintenance, social comparison, staff expectations, insurance escalation, and a whole new lifestyle script that now demands to be funded forever. A luxury car is not transport. It is a recurring invoice dressed as self-expression. People who inherit or win money often think they are buying a rival. Very often they are just buying a more expensive pace of decline. You do not need a richer looking life. You need a lower friction life. That difference is everything. The source then moves to one of the ugliest realities of sudden money. Do not lend to friends. Do not invest in their businesses. Do not start writing checks simply because the cat is out of the bag and everybody has now discovered needs, ideas, dreams, and small temporary help requests. Fay file a site, Fay turn 83 file 0 Fay, of course they do. Money attracts entitlement, the way light attracts insects. I call this puncture risk. Every informal loan, every sentimental investment, every rescue check, every, ID do it for you conversation is a puncture in the reservoir wall. One puncture can be survived. 10 punctures turn a water supply into a memory. Worse, the money rarely leaves cleanly. It takes dignity, trust, and family peace with it. If you say yes, they may lose it and resent your questions. If you say no, they may resent your refusal. The source makes that point clearly too. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 83, file 0 Fay, so choose the version that protects your children, not the one that flatters other adults for 6 months. That same logic applies to starting a business immediately. The source says not to do it, and I agree with the principle behind that warning. 9 out of 10 businesses fail. And newly rich people are especially vulnerable to founder delusion because money plus fantasy feels like vision. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 83, file 0. Fay, I call this the sovereignty mirage. The sovereignty mirage is when a person confuses possessing capital with knowing how to allocate risk. They have always dreamed of being the boss. Now they have the money, and so they assume the dream was missing only cash. Usually it was missing competence, timing, industry knowledge, operating temperament, scar tissue, distribution, systems, judgment. Owning water does not make you an irrigation engineer if you want to build something later. Fine, but the reservoir must survive your ego first. Then the document says something else adults need to hear. Prepare for change. Money does not remove problems. It changes their shape. People will try to sue you, scam you, manipulate you, and emotionally leverage you. Fay file site, Fay turn 83 file 0 Fay. That is not paranoia. That is exposure management. Wealth paints a target. It changes what other people think can be taken from you. It also changes how much damage one bad decision can do. The poor can lose a small amount. The newly rich can lose the structure that would have protected multiple generations. That is why Nafadet Fay becomes very expensive after the flood. Then the source makes a move many people would classify as non-financial. But it is deeply financial. Get healthier. Use the money to extend the life that will enjoy it. Get the medical checkup. Improve how you eat. Improve how you sleep. Improve how you maintain the machine that has to live inside the new reality. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 83 file 0 Fay, call this body preservation. Because sudden money is wasted on a body still behaving like it owes poverty one final performance. Let's put it, hell is not indulgence here, it is asset protection. A healthier body lengthens the runway, sharpens judgment, lowers future liabilities, and improves the quality of every hour the reservoir is supposed to protect. Now we reach the most important principle in the whole file, the 5% rule. The source says your job is to understand the money as a tree. Invest it wisely enough that it throws off annual fruit. Spend the fruit, protect the tree. Do not cut it down for temporary firewood. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 83 file 0 Fay. That is the entire kingdom in one sentence. I call it the runoff rule. The runoff rule says you may enjoy what the reservoir produces, not what the walls themselves are made of. That is the fundamental difference between a steward and a spender. The spender sees a pile and asks, what can I buy? The steward sees a machine and asks, what can this throw off every year if I don't mutilate it? That question alone separates curses from dynasties. Sudden money becomes a curse when principle is consumed for identity. Sudden money becomes a dynasty when principle is protected and runoff is enjoyed. That is why the source later talks about protecting children through trust structures and controlled access rather than letting them rip the original capital apart. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 83 file 0 Fay. That is not cruelty. It is inheritance maturity. I call it delayed access architecture. because the greatest gift you can give your children is not immediate access to principal. It is a structure that protects them from both scarcity and stupidity. Unprotected money often corrupts the character of the receiver. Controlled runoff, by contrast, can fund education, opportunity, experimentation, and stability without letting one emotionally immature season destroy the family reservoir. Then the source says something most people laugh off until divorce teaches it in blood. Do not cheat on your partner. Temptation will grow with wealth, and the cost of betrayal will be enormous, not only emotionally but financially. Faithlessite Faturn 83, File 0 Fay. That should not even need to be said. But adulthood is full of people who become stupid precisely when external validation finally gets easier to buy. I call this the breach from within. Families are one of the main walls around long-term capital. If wealth inflames vanity, entitlement, lust, or secret identity games, then the reservoir gets breached from the most expensive direction possible. The source ends with "play it safe," and I understand why. Faithlessite Faturn 83, File 0 Fay. Most people hearing that line will translate it as "be boring." That is not what it means. It means do not confuse luck with competence. Do not push your luck, because you think getting the money proved you are somehow chosen. Do not turn one improbable event into a justification for a decade of reckless decisions. The law of averages line in the bonus section is a little theatrical, but the spirit behind it is sound. Once extraordinary luck hits, stop asking the universe to certify your ego. Protect what arrived. Faithlessite Faturn 83, File 0 Fay. That is maturity. And now let me compress the whole thing into one brutal truth. Sudden wealth is not a personal upgrade. It is a systems exam. Can you keep quiet? Can you patch leaks? Can you keep routine? Can you tolerate the settling window? Can you learn before you move? Can you resist looking rich? Can you say no to punctures? Can you avoid playing founder with inherited rain? Can you prepare for predators? Can you preserve the body? Can you live off runoff instead of principal? Can you protect the next generation from access without wisdom? Can you keep the family wall intact? Can you behave as though the event never happened, except that debt, panic, and fragility quietly left your life? That is what this kind of money is for. Not to help you audition for a richer character, to help you become a harder to destroy one. If you understand that, then sudden money becomes one of the greatest gifts life can hand a family. If you do not, it becomes a compressed course in public self-harm. So here's the question I want to leave in your chest. If a flood of money hit your life tonight, would you build a reservoir, or would you throw a party on wet ground and call the collapse bad luck? That is the whole game. Because wealth that arrives suddenly does not ask whether you are grateful. It asks whether you are structurally mature. And if you are, the money becomes a quiet machine that feeds generations. If you are not, the money becomes proof that a fool and his fortune do not stay in the same room for long. That is why the first job of sudden wealth is not spending. It is containment. And if you can do that, if you can protect the perimeter, patch the leaks, keep your ego on a leash, live under the comfort ceiling, refuse puncture risk, obey the runoff rule, and treat the principal like a living system instead of dead cash, then something extraordinary happens. The flood stops being danger, it becomes irrigation. Then your children drink from it, then your grandchildren can build from it. Then your family stops being one lucky generation and becomes a disciplined one. That is the only form of sudden wealth worth admiring. One more thing needs to be said, because people who receive sudden money often misunderstand playing it safe. They think it means shrinking their life into fear. It does not. It means refusing to turn one stroke of luck into an excuse for 10 acts of stupidity. Safety at this stage is not timidity. It is balance. The source leans into that word in its closing stretch. And rightly so. Balance is what keeps the reservoir from becoming either a swamp or a floodplain. You do not need to hide under your bed because you inherited money. You do not need to become suspicious of every joy, every upgrade, every dream, every ambition. But you do need to weigh every move against one central question. Does this strengthen the reservoir or weaken it? That is the only question mature wealth ever really asks. If a purchase lowers recurring pressure and leaves the principal machine stronger, it may be wise. If a decision flatters your ego while increasing fixed costs, social exposure, emotional temptation, or structural fragility, it is probably poison in a nicer bottle. That is what balance means. Not equal spending and saving. Not some decorative middle point between recklessness and fear, Real balance means that the reservoir remains the master system, and everything else must justify itself to that system. The house must justify itself, the advisor must justify himself, the business idea must justify itself, the family gift must justify itself, the neighborhood, the car, the vacation, the new identity, the public posture, the I finally can speech inside your head. All of it must justify itself to the reservoir. Because once you forget that hierarchy, you stop being a steward and become a consumer with a temporary miracle. And temporary miracles are exactly how family wealth dies. The source also tries to warn you about being used by other people, and I want to sharpen that warning one last time. When money arrives suddenly, you do not just inherit options, you inherit other people as unfinished fantasies. They will try to live their unlived lives through your account. They will try to draft your luck into their debts, their ventures, their emotional holes, their appetite, their drama, their imagined fairness. If you are weak, you will call surrender generosity. If you are wise, you will understand that one of the highest forms of love is refusing to let your reservoir be turned into a public sponge. This is especially true with children. Giving them comfort is one thing. Giving them unstructured access to principle before character forms is often just a slower version of abandonment. Real protection means giving them water, not handing them the damn keys while they still think attention and money are the same thing. And now we are back at the central truth. Sudden wealth is not measured by how much you received. It is measured by what remains 5 years later, 10 years later. 1 generation later, anyone can receive a flood. Very few can civilize it. That is why I care so much less about the event than about the architecture built after the event. The event is chance. The architecture is character. And character is the only part that compounds reliably across generations. So if life ever hands you sudden money, do not ask first what you can buy. Ask what kind of system this money now requires from you. If you answer that question, well, the money may become the quietest and kindest force your family ever knew. If you answer it badly, the money will not merely disappear. It will teach everyone around you that luck is dangerous and that wealth is a curse. Do not teach that lesson. Build the reservoir, guard the perimeter, obey the runoff rule, and let the family after you inherit discipline. Not just dollars.